At 10:21 a.m. on December 20th, 1943, at more than 20,000 feet over Bremen, a lone airman was slumped sideways inside a shattered metal compartment, his boots braced against the vibrating floor of a B-17 that no longer flew straight. He was wedged into the radio position, shoulders pressed against twisted aluminum, one knee bent awkwardly beneath him. Blood crept slowly from his brow, warm for a second, then already turning cold as it slid toward his eye. Outside, sunlight flashed briefly across a torn section of fuselage. Far off the left wing, barely visible through the broken cloud cover, a dark speck shifted position, too deliberate to be debris, too steady to be chance. Inside the aircraft, the noise was constant. Engines coughed. Wind screamed through a rupture in the skin. Somewhere aft, a gun rattled, then stopped. The radio went dead. No call, no signal, no movement. In the cockpit, the crew waited for a voice that didn't come. Flak had just walked across the bomber in a tight pattern, black bursts punching holes through aluminum and flesh alike. Men were wounded. Systems were failing. Oxygen lines had snapped, and in the radio compartment, the man responsible for keeping them connected to the outside world had gone completely silent. Someone finally said it out loud, "He's gone." No one argued. At this altitude, exposed to freezing air and hit by shrapnel, nobody stayed conscious long, and radio operators weren't trained for heroics. They weren't pilots. They weren't commanders. They didn't stand behind heavy armor or control the aircraft's fate. They sat alone in narrow compartments and relayed messages. That was all. The bomber shuddered again as another flak burst detonated nearby. Loose papers lifted and fluttered like dying birds. Frost crept across the metal walls. The aircraft began a shallow, unplanned descent. Far behind them, that distant speck split into two, then three. German fighters were reforming for another pass. Up front, the pilot tightened his grip and stared straight ahead. The crew counted what they had left: ammo, altitude, time. They did not count the radio operator anymore, because silence up here usually meant only one thing. And yet, somewhere deep inside the wounded aircraft, beneath the roar of engines and the rush of freezing air, something shifted. A hand moved against the floor, a breath caught, and a man everyone believed was finished began to stir. If stories like this matter to you, stay with me and make sure you're subscribed, because what happens next wasn't supposed to be possible, and the enemy hadn't even started their attack yet. Forrest Vosler wasn't supposed to matter once the shooting started. At 10:24 a.m., as the bomber limped east of Bremen, he lay half-curled in the radio compartment, an aluminum box barely wide enough to sit upright, now warped and torn open like a crushed tin can. Cold air poured in through a jagged hole where the fuselage used to be sealed tight. It slammed into his face and chest, stealing breath with every second. His headset hung useless at his neck. The radio itself was dark. Vosler blinked hard. The world refused to sharpen. His right eye burned like it had sand ground into it. His left saw little more than gray light and drifting shadows. Blood clung to his eyelashes, freezing them together. He tried to wipe it away. His hand came back red. The flak had hit without warning. 1 second he'd been listening to routine chatter, tracking bearings, doing the quiet work nobody noticed. The next, the aircraft had jumped sideways, metal screaming, pressure vanishing. Shrapnel tore through his face. The oxygen mask was gone. The radio was dead. And then, nothing. That was when the crew stopped counting him. Vosler wasn't a pilot trained to muscle a crippled bomber home. He wasn't a gunner standing behind thick armor and twin Todd 50s. He wasn't even supposed to leave his station unless ordered. Radio operators didn't fight fighters. They passed messages. They logged positions. They stayed out of the way. Vosler tried to push himself upright. Pain flared through his skull, sharp and blinding. His knee slipped. His shoulder slammed into the bulkhead. The aircraft lurched again, dropping another 100 feet. Somewhere behind him, a gun barked once, then went silent. The temperature kept falling. At this altitude, exposed like this, minutes mattered. Men froze fast. Men blacked out faster. Vosler could feel it already, the creeping numbness in his fingers, the way his thoughts came slower, like they were wading through syrup. He forced himself to breathe anyway, short breaths, controlled. He listened. The engines were still turning, but uneven. One coughed, then caught again. The bomber vibrated like it was holding itself together through sheer will. Then came a sound that didn't belong inside the aircraft, a distant whine. High, thin, rising. Vosler didn't need clear vision to recognize it. Fighters. German engines climbing hard, angling into position for a clean second pass. They'd already tasted blood. Now they were coming back to finish the job. Vosler pressed his forehead briefly against the cold metal wall and steadied himself. The radio was dead. His eyes were failing. His compartment was open to the sky. And everyone else thought he was already gone. If you're still with me, hit like, because this is the moment where most men would stay down. Vosler didn't. He reached out blindly toward his shattered station, fingers searching through dangling wires and bent metal. And somewhere behind the bomber, the fighters rolled in closer. At 10:27 a.m., the cold finally started to win. It crept in slow, almost polite at first, numb fingers, stiff wrists, then it dug deeper, settling into Vosler's bones like it planned to stay. The open wound in the fuselage howled louder as the bomber lost another slice of altitude. The sky outside looked washed out and thin like it might tear if touched. Vosler tried to focus on the radio. The shape was there. He knew it by memory more than sight. Dials, switches, knobs that had felt familiar just an hour earlier now blurred together like they were melting. He leaned closer. That was a mistake. Pain detonated behind his eyes, sharp and sudden, like a flashbulb going off inside his skull. He jerked back with a short, involuntary gasp. Blood slid free again, warm against his cheek, then instantly cold as it met the air. His vision dimmed, not darkness, something worse, a fog. A milky gray haze that swallowed edges and depth. He could see movement, but not detail. Light, but not shape. Nearly blind. Vosler knew what that meant up here. It meant you stayed still. It meant you conserved strength. It meant you waited to be carried down if the aircraft made it at all. He listened again. The fighters were closer now. That thin whine had thickened into a growl, engines straining as they climbed into firing position. Somewhere along the bomber's spine, a gun opened up in a short burst, then stopped. Either jammed or the man behind it was hit. The aircraft shuddered violently. Loose metal clanged against metal. A spent casing rolled past Vosler's boot, clinking softly before disappearing into a dark corner. Oxygen-starved air burned his lungs with every breath. He realized something then. No one was coming for him. In the chaos of a flak-damaged bomber, with wounded men and failing systems, nobody had time to check a silent radio compartment. To the rest of the crew, he was already written off, another casualty in a long list they didn't have the luxury to mourn yet. Vosler swallowed and tasted blood. He could stay down. He could close his eyes and let the cold take the edge off the pain. It would be easy. No one would question it. No one would blame him. The fighters roared louder, closer. Vosler shifted his weight and tried to stand. His legs buckled instantly. He slammed down hard, teeth clacking together. White sparks burst across his vision. For a long second, the world tilted and threatened to slide away completely. He stayed conscious through pure stubbornness. He pressed one palm flat against the deck and forced himself to breathe slow again. In, out, count it, control it. The way they taught him back when training still felt theoretical. Somewhere in the bomber someone shouted, but the words were lost in the roar. Vosler reached forward once more, this time lower, feeling along the wall until his fingers brushed something solid. Cold steel, not the radio, something else. And in that moment, with his vision failing and the enemy closing fast, Vosler understood the choice in front of him: stay silent, or get back into the fight, blind, bleeding, and freezing, when nobody expected him to move again. If this story has you locked in, make sure you're subscribed, because the next decision changes everything. Vosler tightened his grip, and began to pull himself upright anyway. At 10:30 a.m., the bomber shuddered hard enough to knock Vosler sideways again. The aircraft dipped, corrected, then dipped once more, an unsteady rhythm that told him the pilot was fighting damaged controls. Somewhere forward, an engine coughed and sputtered like it was running on borrowed time. The cold intensified, biting deeper now, stealing strength faster than pain ever could. Vosler lay there for a moment, cheek pressed to the metal floor. It vibrated beneath him, alive. Barely. He opened his eyes. The world was still a blur, light and shadow without edges, but he could tell one thing clearly now. Time was running out. The fighters were no longer just a sound. He could feel them, through the aircraft, through the airframe, through the way the bomber tensed as if it sensed what was coming. A second pass meant concentrated fire. It meant engines, control surfaces, crew positions. It meant this flight might not get another chance. Vosler rolled onto his side and reached again for the wall, using it to haul himself up inch by inch. His arm shook violently. Every movement sent a spike of pain through his skull, but he kept going, jaw clenched tight enough to ache. He got to one knee. The compartment spun. He waited it out, counted breaths, let the dizziness settle just enough. The easy option was right there. Stay down. Stay still. Let someone else handle it. That's what everyone expected. Radio operators weren't supposed to leave their post in combat, especially not half-blind and bleeding. They weren't trained for gunfights. They weren't the last line of defense. Vosler laughed once under his breath. It came out rough and short, barely more than air. Because his post was already gone. The radio was wrecked. The compartment was open to the sky. His job, on paper, was finished, but the bomber wasn't. Vosler reached forward and felt along the bulkhead until his fingers found the ladder rung leading toward the adjacent section. The metal burned with cold through his glove. He tested his weight carefully. The aircraft jolted again. He nearly lost it. Somewhere aft, a gun rattled, longer this time, then stopped abruptly. Silence followed, not the good kind. Vosler didn't need to see to understand what that meant. A position had gone quiet. Another man was either wounded, frozen, or worse. Vosler pulled himself upright fully now, swaying slightly, one hand locked tight around the ladder rung. Blood dripped steadily from his face, pattering softly against the deck. Each drop felt louder than it should have been. He paused there, breathing hard, fighting the cold, the pain, the narrowing world. This was the point of no return. Once he moved forward, there would be no pretending he was out of the fight, no resting, no relief. Whatever strength he had left would be spent fast. The fighter's engines rose again, unmistakable now, close enough that he could almost feel the heat of their exhaust through the bomber's skin. Vosler took one last breath. Then he pulled himself toward the gun position the crew believed was already lost. If this moment hit you, tap like, because what happens next is the sound that changes everything. And the crew was about to hear it. At 10:33 a.m., the first German fighter broke from formation. It came in low and fast, sliding up beneath the bomber's damaged tail, nose angled just enough to rake the fuselage from end to end. Tracer rounds stitched the air, snapping past the aircraft like hot needles. The B-17 shuddered as rounds punched into its skin. Inside, the crew braced. They waited for the tail gun to answer. It didn't. That silence hit harder than the flak. A bomber without defensive fire was an invitation. The fighters knew it. They tightened their turn, confident now, lining up for a longer, cleaner run. Up forward, the pilot swore under his breath. Somewhere midship, a wounded gunner tried to shift position and failed. The aircraft felt suddenly naked, exposed in every direction. Then, a sharp metallic clack cut through the roar. Not loud, not dramatic. Just wrong. A split second later, twin .50 caliber guns erupted from the position everyone believed was dead. The sound slammed through the bomber, deep, rhythmic, unmistakable. Empty casings rattled and bounced across the deck. Tracers reached out into open sky, steady and controlled, not wild. The crew froze. That gun wasn't supposed to fire. The fighter pilot froze too. His aircraft jerked violently as rounds tore past his canopy. He broke off instinctively, rolling hard away from the bomber. His clean attack shattered in an instant. Inside the B-17, men looked at each other in disbelief. Someone shouted, "Who the hell?" No one finished the sentence, because there was only one position that gun could be firing from. And the man assigned to it had been silent for minutes. Vosler stood behind the weapon, knees locked to keep himself upright, vision narrowed to a dim tunnel of light and motion. He couldn't see the fighter clearly, just a darker shape moving against the pale sky, but he didn't need perfect sight. He aimed where the threat had to be. His hands moved on memory alone. Burst, pause, correct, fire again. The recoil hammered into his shoulders. Pain flared with every vibration, but he ignored it. The cold didn't matter anymore. The blood in his eyes didn't matter either, only the rhythm did. Behind him, the bomber surged slightly as the pilot leveled out, given precious seconds he hadn't expected to get. The fighters pulled wider now, more cautious, reassessing a target that had just come back to life. Someone in the crew laughed once, sharp, disbelieving. Another whispered, "He's still fighting." If you're feeling that moment, go ahead and subscribe, because this was only the beginning. Vosler kept firing, but the fighters weren't done yet. They were circling back, angrier now, and ready to make sure that gun went silent for good. At 10:36 a.m., the fighters came back smarter. They didn't rush this time. They stayed wide, just beyond easy range, sliding through the thin cloud layers like sharks testing the water. Vosler could feel the change even without seeing it clearly, the way the bomber tensed, the way the airframe hummed with waiting pressure. His vision was nearly gone now. The world had collapsed into light and motion. No faces, no wings, just contrast, just direction. He tracked shapes by instinct, the way a man feels a punch coming before he sees it. The guns grew heavier in his hands, not from weight, from fatigue. Each burst sent a jolt through his arms and into his skull. His injured eye throbbed in time with the recoil. Blood seeped again, blurring what little sight he had left. He blinked hard, forcing it back, refusing to let the darkness win. A fighter peeled off the clouds on the bomber's high side. Vosler felt it before he saw it. He adjusted the barrel a few degrees and squeezed. The guns barked. Tracers reached out. The fighter snapped away at the last second, rolling hard, its attack spoiled before it ever settled in. Inside the aircraft, the mood shifted. Men leaned forward. Wounded hands tightened on straps. Someone behind him yelled encouragement he barely heard. The bomber took another hit, flak this time, bursting close enough to rock the entire fuselage. Vosler staggered, caught himself against the mount, and kept firing. His gloves were slick now. Cold. Blood. Oil. He couldn't tell which was which. A warning light flickered somewhere forward. Fuel pressure dropping. The fighters noticed too. They dove together now, two at once, one high, one low. A classic squeeze. No wasted motion. This was how bombers died. Vosler fired at the high threat first, forcing it to break, then dragged the barrels down toward the lower shape. His timing was off. His sight was worse. Rounds tore through empty air. The fighter kept coming. For a split second, Vosler thought he was too late. Then the bomber lurched unexpectedly, damaged controls, pilot fighting for balance, and the sudden movement threw off the enemy's aim. Vosler seized the moment and fired again, long and steady. The fighter veered off, streaming smoke. Inside the aircraft, a cheer went up, short, raw, almost surprised. Vosler didn't celebrate. He was breathing hard now, too hard. Each breath burned his lungs. His legs trembled so badly he locked them straight just to stay upright. He knew this couldn't last. Ammo was finite, strength even more so. And the fighters were still out there, regrouping again, waiting for the exact moment he couldn't pull the trigger anymore. If you're still watching, hit like, because this man is running out of time fast. Vosler leaned into the gun mount and steadied himself for the next pass. And deep down he knew the hardest part was still ahead. At 10:39 a.m., something subtle changed inside the bomber. Not the damage, not the cold, not the fighters circling just out of sight. It was the crew. Men who'd been bracing for impact now listened differently. They leaned into the noise instead of shrinking from it. They counted bursts. They waited for the familiar rhythm of the guns before exhaling. Because the gun was still firing, steady, controlled, alive. Up front, the pilot glanced at the engineer, then back at the instruments. He didn't say anything. He didn't have to. Everyone in the cockpit understood what this meant. Someone they'd written off was still fighting. Behind them, a wounded waist gunner dragged himself closer to his position, driven by the sound alone. Another crewman tightened a strap around his arm and forced himself upright, pain pushed aside by a sudden surge of belief. If Vosler was still in it, then maybe they all were. Outside, a fighter dipped through the cloud cover and lined up again, confident but cautious now. Vosler tracked the movement as best he could, sight almost gone, relying on vibration and sound more than vision. He fired short bursts, corrected, fired again. The fighter peeled off early, refusing to commit. That hesitation mattered. Every second bought altitude. Every broken attack bought distance from Bremen. Every burst kept the bomber from becoming an easy kill. Vosler's arms shook uncontrollably now. His breathing rasped. He could feel the cold working its way up his legs, turning muscle into dead weight. His vision narrowed further, the edges fading into nothing. He knew something the rest of the crew didn't yet. This wasn't sustainable. He couldn't hold the gun much longer. And just as that thought settled in, the bomber jolted hard, far harder than before. A system failed somewhere forward. The engines roared unevenly. Warning lights flared. The aircraft began to drift. The fighters noticed instantly. They broke formation. They were coming back, low, fast, and coordinated. If this story has earned your respect so far, make sure you're subscribed, because the next phase isn't about firepower anymore. Vosler shifted his stance, trying to stay upright, because the fight was about to move beyond the guns. At 10:42 a.m., the gun finally went quiet. Not because Vosler chose to stop, because his hands wouldn't answer the command anymore. They trembled violently against the grips, fingers stiff and uncooperative, muscles drained down to raw instinct. He leaned forward, forehead pressed briefly against the cold metal of the mount, fighting to stay conscious as the bomber lurched again, this time in a long, uneven roll. The fighters were still there. He could feel them waiting. But Vosler heard something else now, a different problem. The engines were running rough, bad rough. One was coughing in a pattern that meant fuel starvation. Another surged, then dipped, struggling to hold power. The aircraft wasn't just under attack anymore. It was lost. Vosler forced himself away from the gun and turned back toward the radio compartment, each step clumsy and slow. His shoulder slammed into the bulkhead. He bounced off it, barely catching himself. The floor felt farther away than it should have been. He didn't know if he could even see the radio controls anymore. But he knew where they were. He dropped into the chair and reached out, fingers brushing over twisted knobs and snapped wires. The set looked dead, but dead didn't always mean useless. Sometimes it just meant damaged. Sometimes it meant you tried anyway. Vosler keyed the switch. Nothing. He adjusted it again, relying on memory. Still nothing. The bomber shuddered violently as flak burst close enough to rattle his teeth. Somewhere forward, someone yelled a warning he couldn't hear clearly. The fighters hadn't left. They were just letting the aircraft bleed. Vosler leaned closer, squinting through the haze. He keyed the transmitter one more time. Static cracked faintly through the headset. Barely there, but real. Vosler swallowed hard and forced air into his lungs. His voice came out rough, uneven, but it came out. He began transmitting position, damage, condition, slowly, carefully, repeating everything twice. He couldn't see the dials clearly enough to know if it was working. He just kept talking, because silence was death. If this moment has you locked in, hit like, because this wasn't a message meant to be heard once. It was a lifeline. And Vosler had no idea yet if anyone was listening. At 10:45 a.m., Vosler was no longer sure where his body ended and the aircraft began. The vibration blurred everything together. The seat pressed into his back. The headset clamped against his ears. The cold gnawed at him steadily now, not sharp anymore, dangerously dull. He kept talking anyway, slow, measured, repeating every word, call sign, heading, altitude dropping. He paused between phrases, not for effect, but because his lungs demanded it. Each breath scraped. His mouth felt thick, his tongue heavy, like it didn't belong to him anymore. Static answered back. Faint, broken, but there. Vosler's heart kicked harder at the sound. He leaned forward, squinting uselessly at the panel, adjusting dials by memory alone. His hands shook so badly he had to brace his wrist against the console just to keep from slipping. Outside, the bomber jolted again, another near miss. Flak thundered close enough to flash white through his ruined vision. Somewhere aft, metal screamed as a section of the aircraft took damage it couldn't afford. The fighters were still circling. They hadn't committed again yet. They were waiting. Vosler keyed the transmitter again and repeated the message, voice cracking now, fighting the numbness creeping up his jaw. He forced himself to slow down, to stay clear. Panic ruined transmissions. Calm got men home. Inside the cockpit, the pilot tilted his head slightly. "Say again," came the faint reply through the static. Vosler almost laughed. Someone heard him. He repeated everything again and again. Each time felt harder than the last. His vision tunneled tighter. Black crept in at the edges, threatening to swallow the light completely. The bomber dipped sharply. Vosler gripped the console to keep from sliding out of the chair. His strength was nearly gone now. The cold had climbed into his chest. His hands felt like they belonged to someone else, and still he talked. Because as long as he was transmitting, the bomber wasn't alone. If you're still with me, make sure you're subscribed, because this next phase decides whether that signal is enough. Outside, the fighters finally broke their holding pattern. They rolled in together, and Vosler was almost out of time. At 10:48 a.m., the fighters came in as a pair, not rushed, not reckless, clean and deliberate. Vosler heard them before the crew did, the engines tightening into a hard, rising scream that cut through the bomber's wounded rhythm. He felt the aircraft tense, like an animal bracing for impact. He tried to push back from the radio chair. His legs didn't answer. For a split second, fear punched through the cold. Not fear of dying, fear of being useless now, right at the end. Vosler dragged one boot under him and forced himself upright, hands sliding along the bulkhead for balance. The world tilted violently. Black crept in again, thick and heavy, but he shook his head hard and kept moving. The gun position felt farther away than before. Each step took effort. Each breath burned. The bomber lurched as the fighters opened fire, rounds hammering into metal, tearing through skin and structure. Somewhere forward, glass exploded. A man shouted. Another voice answered, strained but steady. Vosler reached the mount and leaned into it, more support than strength now. He couldn't see the fighters clearly anymore, but he could hear where they were. He fired, short bursts, controlled, everything he had left. The guns bucked weakly now, ammo running low. His arms screamed in protest. His vision collapsed to almost nothing, just light, just motion. One fighter broke off early. The other stayed longer, too long. Vosler fired again, holding the trigger down a second longer than he should have. The fighter snapped away at the last instant, attack spoiled, rounds missing critical systems by yards instead of inches. Inside the bomber, the pilot seized the moment and shoved the nose down slightly, trading altitude for speed. The aircraft groaned, protesting, but it responded. England was still far. But Bremen was finally behind them. Vosler let go of the trigger. The guns went silent again. This time the silence felt different. He sagged forward, forehead resting against cold steel, chest heaving. His body was finished. There was nothing left to give. Behind him, the radio crackled faintly. A voice, clearer now. Guidance, instructions, a way home. If this story has kept you locked in, hit like, because this is the moment where survival stops being luck and starts being earned. Vosler turned back toward the radio one last time. Because the hardest part wasn't the fighting. It was staying awake long enough to finish the job. At 10:52 a.m., Forrest Vosler was running on nothing but will. The bomber leveled out slightly, engines still uneven but holding. The worst of the fighters had peeled away now, their job unfinished but close enough. Vosler knew better than to believe they were gone for good. He dragged himself back into the radio compartment, every movement slow, deliberate, like gravity had doubled inside the aircraft. His knees hit the deck hard. He didn't feel it. He barely felt anything anymore. The radio crackled again, clearer this time. Ground control. England. Vosler fumbled the headset back into place and keyed the transmitter, fighting the heavy pull behind his eyes. The darkness kept surging forward, trying to take him under. He blinked hard, forcing his focus back to the sound of the voice on the other end. They were giving him headings now, bearings, simple instructions. Hold this course. Confirm altitude. Say again. Vosler answered each one, slowly, carefully, repeating himself to be sure. He couldn't trust his own voice anymore. It sounded far away, like it belonged to someone else. The bomber shook as another system faltered. Fuel gauges dipped lower. The cold crept deeper, stealing the last warmth from his hands. His fingers stiffened around the key, and he had to force them to move, stay awake. That became the mission, not flying, not shooting, staying conscious long enough to keep talking. Vosler counted seconds between transmissions, counted breaths, counted heartbeats, anything to keep his mind from drifting. Silence now would mean confusion in the cockpit. Silence would mean guesswork. And guesswork got bombers lost. Inside the aircraft, the crew listened to his voice like a lifeline. Every response steadied them. Every confirmation told them they weren't alone in the sky yet. Vosler felt the darkness surge again, stronger this time. His head dipped forward, his grip loosened. He caught himself just in time. If you're still here, subscribe, because the margin between survival and silence has never been thinner than it is right now. Vosler forced another transmission through clenched teeth, and somewhere ahead, through cloud and cold, land was getting closer, but he wasn't there yet. At 10:58 a.m., the bomber hit heavy cloud. The light outside vanished, swallowed whole, and the aircraft felt suddenly alone again, engines droning blind through gray nothing. Icing crept along the wings. The controls stiffened. Every gauge looked wrong in its own quiet way. Vosler slumped in the radio chair, chin pressed to his chest. His eyelids fluttered. He shook his head hard, trying to clear it. The movement sent a bolt of pain through his skull, sharp enough to drag him back from the edge. He tasted blood again and didn't bother wiping it away. He didn't have the strength. The radio crackled. Confirm heading. Vosler lifted the mic with both hands because one wasn't enough anymore. His fingers barely curled around it. He answered slowly, each word forced, careful not to slur. The reply came back, firm, calm, professional. They were guiding him now, step by step, through cloud, through damage, through exhaustion. Inside the cockpit, the pilot followed those instructions like gospel. No arguing, no second-guessing. The radio operator, half-blind and bleeding, was the only thing keeping them oriented. Vosler's vision dimmed further, collapsing inward. The edges went black. The center blurred. The world shrank to sound and vibration and the pressure of the mic against his lips. Stay awake. He counted again. Breath in, breath out. The bomber lurched suddenly, dropping hard for a terrifying second before the pilot hauled it back up. Vosler gasped, the shock nearly knocking him out cold. He caught himself on the edge of the console. Another warning light flared. Fuel was almost gone. The voice on the radio tightened, not panicked, but sharper now. Instructions came faster. Adjustments, final corrections. Vosler forced his eyes open again. He could not miss this part. If you've made it this far, hit like, because this is the razor's edge where everything breaks or holds. Vosler answered one more call, then another, his voice barely above a whisper now. Outside the cloud, somewhere ahead, the coastline waited. But Vosler was slipping fast, and there was one last push left before darkness finally took him. At 11:03 a.m., Forrest Vosler felt himself slipping, not suddenly, not dramatically. Just fading. The bomber broke out of the cloud layer in a long, uneven glide. Pale winter light flooded the cockpit. Below them, the gray surface of the North Sea stretched out, cold, flat, unforgiving. Somewhere beyond it lay England, if they could hold together a little longer. Vosler sagged forward, forehead resting against the radio console. His breathing came shallow now, uneven. The cold had settled deep into his chest, heavy and crushing. His hands barely responded when he tried to move them. The radio crackled again. One more heading. One more confirmation. Vosler lifted the mic with both hands, knuckles white with effort. His vision was almost completely gone now, just light and dark, no detail, but he didn't need sight for this. He knew the words. He forced them out, slow and clear, every syllable costing him something he didn't have left to spare. When he finished, he held the mic there for a second longer, just in case. Just in case that was the last thing he ever said. The reply came back immediately, strong, certain. They had him. They had the bomber. They had a path. Vosler let the mic slip from his fingers. It tapped softly against the console and hung there, swaying with the vibration of the aircraft. He leaned back in the chair, head lolling to one side, eyes finally closing. The guns stayed silent. The fighters didn't return. Inside the bomber, the crew listened to the engines and waited, afraid to celebrate, afraid to breathe too deep. But something had changed. The danger felt like it was behind them now, still close, still sharp, but no longer closing in. Vosler didn't hear any of that. He was gone, out cold, body spent, mind finally surrendering after holding the line far longer than anyone thought possible. If this moment hit you, subscribe, because the fight may be over, but the cost is about to become clear. The bomber descended toward friendly ground, battered but flying, and only now did the crew begin to understand what that silence had really cost. At 11:19 a.m., the bomber hit the runway hard. The landing wasn't pretty. One wheel screamed. The fuselage shuddered. Metal protested all the way down until the aircraft finally rolled to a stop in a long cloud of smoke and steam. Engines were cut. The sudden quiet felt unreal. For a moment, no one moved. Then the crew began to unstrap, stiff and slow, adrenaline draining out of them all at once. Men helped each other stand. Someone laughed shakily. Someone else just sat there, head in hands. They were alive. Only then did the pilot turn and ask the question that had been hanging in the air for nearly an hour. Check the radio operator. Two crewmen made their way back through the damaged fuselage, stepping over debris, ducking torn metal, passing positions that were empty or dark. The smell of oil and burned insulation hung thick in the air. They reached the radio compartment. Vosler was still in the chair, slumped sideways, head bandaged crudely with torn cloth. Face streaked with dried blood and frost. His eyes were closed. For half a second, no one spoke. Then one of them stepped closer and saw his chest rise, slow, shallow, but unmistakable. "He's alive," someone said quietly. They stared at him in silence, really seeing him now for the first time since Bremen. The ruined radio, the frozen blood, the hands still curled as if gripping a microphone that was no longer there. This was the man they'd written off. The man who'd gone silent, the man who'd come back to life long enough to fight, to talk, to guide them home. Medics rushed in moments later, moving fast, voices low and professional. They worked carefully, deliberately, like they already understood what kind of fight he'd been in. As Vosler was lifted onto a stretcher, one crewman reached out and squeezed his shoulder once, gentle, grateful, wordless. If this story earned your respect, hit like right now, because this is the part history almost skips. Vosler was carried away, still breathing, still alive. But what he'd done up there was only just beginning to be understood. They pieced it together later, not in the air, not on the runway, but in quiet rooms days afterward, when reports were written and statements compared. The bomber had taken heavy damage over Bremen. Multiple crew wounded, systems failing, fighters pressing hard, survival odds slim. And in the middle of it all, the radio operator everyone believed was dead. Forrest Vosler had been hit by flak. Shrapnel tore into his face and eyes. Decompression blasted freezing air into his compartment. Blood blinded him. The radio was wrecked. The gun position went silent. By every measure, his part should have ended there. Instead, nearly blind and bleeding, Vosler dragged himself back into the fight. He manned a gun position long enough to break repeated fighter attacks. He transmitted emergency signals when the aircraft was lost and disoriented. He stayed conscious long enough to guide a crippled bomber across the North Sea. Not because it was his job, because someone had to. When the official citation was written, the language stayed calm, professional, almost understated. But the meaning was clear. Without him, that bomber does not come home. In 1944, Forrest Vosler was awarded the Medal of Honor, not for flying the plane, not for commanding men, but for refusing to go silent when silence would have been easier. Picture it one last time. A battered B-17, limping through broken cloud cover. Defensive guns still manned. A crew holding together by will alone. And inside, a bloodied airman with bandaged eyes, upright in his seat, hands steady on shattered controls, doing the one thing that kept them alive. Talking, fighting, refusing to quit. If stories like this matter to you, subscribe, because history is full of moments like this that almost disappeared. And remember this, sometimes the man everyone counts out becomes the last voice standing between silence and home.